She had survived 3 combat deployments, 2 IED blasts, and a field surgery performed in a ditch during a sandstorm. But nothing, not a single moment of war, prepared Nurse Claire Bennett for the fight that would happen inside a hospital. The night they threw her out of Riverview Medical Institute, Emily Carter had 8 hours left to live. 17 specialists had already signed off on her death. The machines were ready to be disconnected at dawn. One nurse, dismissed, humiliated, told she didn't belong, saw something every doctor had missed, and what she did next in the dark, in secret, in defiance of everything they ordered her to do, would bring an entire medical system to its knees. If this story moves you, stay until the very end. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Hit like, and drop a comment telling me the city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The first thing Claire Bennett noticed about Riverview Medical Institute was the smell. Not antiseptic, not floor wax. Something underneath those things. Something older, like a building that had been breathing recycled air for too long and didn't know it. She stood in the main lobby at 10:47 p.m. with a duffel bag over one shoulder and her credentials folder tucked under her arm, and she told herself it was just a hospital smell. Every hospital smelled like something was being kept at bay. She'd reported for her first shift 15 minutes early because that was habit, not eagerness. 11 years in the Army had calcified certain behaviors into her bones, and early was one of them. The charge nurse at the main desk, a woman named Sandra with reading glasses pushed up into gray-streaked hair, had looked at Claire's transfer paperwork the way someone looks at a parking ticket, like the problem was self-evident and mildly inconvenient. "Night rotation," Sandra said. "I saw that on the assignment." "Permanently. Dr. Reeves made the schedule himself." She slid the paperwork back without looking up. "Wing C, 3rd floor, long-term neuro." Wing C was where they put the patients who weren't dying fast enough. Claire had worked that kind of ward before, just not inside a building. She'd worked with soldiers whose bodies were present, but whose minds had gone somewhere distant and locked the door behind them. Traumatic brain injuries, dissociative shutdowns, comas from blast pressure that CT scans couldn't fully explain. She knew what dormancy looked like. She also knew what dormancy was covering for. She found her locker, changed, and clocked in at 11:03 p.m. 3 minutes late, technically, because Sandra had held her at the desk longer than necessary. She noted it, filed it mentally, and moved on. The 3rd floor was quiet in the way that felt deliberately maintained. The nurses on the shift change were already bundling up their personal items, and the 2 who acknowledged Claire did so with the flat neutrality of people who had not been told anything good about her. One of them, young, maybe 26, with a ponytail, glanced at the duffel logo and said, "Army?" "Was," Claire said. The young nurse nodded and left. No follow-up, no interest. Claire took the floor report from the outgoing charge and stood at the nurse's station, reading through it while the unit settled into its nighttime rhythms. The soft beeping, the occasional shuffle of a patient shifting in bed, the fluorescent hum that existed somewhere between sound and feeling. Room 317 stopped her. Emily Carter, 24F. Unresponsive vegetative state 8 months, GCS3, feeding tube ventilator assist. Family present intermittently. DNR discussion scheduled for 0. 800 consulting. DNR discussion at 0800 meant someone had already made a decision and was preparing the family for the paperwork. Claire read the rest of the file at the station, then walked to room 317 and stood in the doorway. The room was dim, a single light strip low on the wall, the soft amber glow of monitors. Emily Carter lay in the bed at an angle that said she'd been positioned recently and carefully. She was young. That registered first, not medically, just humanly. The girl in the bed had good cheekbones and short, dark hair and hands that rested at her sides like she was waiting for something. There was a man asleep in the recliner chair by the window. Big man, late 60s, military posture even while unconscious. Shoulders back, jaw set, body occupying space with a kind of controlled weight. A folded dress jacket lay on the floor beside his feet. Claire could see the insignia from the doorway. She did not go in. Not yet. She spent the next 2 hours doing her rounds thoroughly, checking lines, updating fluid charts, noting a small irritation at the IV site on the patient in 311 that the previous shift had documented but not acted on. She changed it, documented her reasoning, moved on. She was building her record the way she always built it, methodically, in case anyone looked back later. At 1:20 a.m., she returned to 317. The general was still asleep. Emily hadn't changed position. The monitors were holding their same quiet numbers. Claire stood at the bedside and looked at her the way she'd looked at soldiers in field hospitals when the equipment was saying one thing and her gut was saying another. She pulled a pen light from her pocket. She ran it slowly across Emily's eyes, not trying to startle, not expecting much. The pupils were fixed and sluggish, responding minimally to light, consistent with the chart's notation of severe neurological suppression. But there was something at the left outer corner, a micro tremor. The kind of movement that doesn't register on a chart because no one is watching for it, and it's gone before you can convince yourself you saw it. Claire stilled the light and waited. It happened again. Not a spasm. Not autonomic reflex. Something more organized than that. She didn't say anything. She put the pen light away and stood quietly, watching Emily's face, then her hands. After about 90 seconds, she saw it there too. A faint, barely there flicker in the tendons along Emily's right wrist. The kind of movement that means the signal is reaching, even if it isn't arriving with enough force to complete anything. "You're in there," Claire said quietly. Not loudly enough to wake the general. She went back to the nurse's station and opened Emily's neurological record from the past 6 months. 4 different attending physicians, 3 consulting neurologists, including a specialist brought in from a research hospital in the Northeast. 17 documented assessments. Every single one noted fixed pupils, absent voluntary response, absent tracking, absent withdrawal to pain stimulus. No one had noted the microtremor. That wasn't laziness. Laziness she could explain. This was something else. Examinations conducted during the day, efficiently, with the conclusion already forming before the assessment was complete. The kind of medicine that happened when everyone had already agreed. She flagged the chart for morning review and noted her observation in the nursing assessment log. Left periorbital microtremor observed 123. Right wrist tendon, micromovement 124. Recommend reevaluation of voluntary motor response before scheduled 800 family consultation. She wrote it clearly, signed it with her credentials, and timestamped it. At 3:15 a.m., Dr. Malcolm Reeves called the nurse's station. He shouldn't have been awake. He shouldn't have even been monitoring the night notes, but apparently someone had flagged her entry for his attention because when Claire picked up, his voice was already leveled at a particular frequency. The one people use when they've decided to be calm as a performance. "You're the transfer nurse, Bennett." "Yes." "I see you've made a notation in the Carter file." "I observed responses inconsistent with the documented neurological status and noted them." "Yes." A brief silence. "The Carter case has been evaluated by specialists across 3 institutions. Are you familiar with who Emily Carter's father is?" "I saw the insignia." "Then you understand there's been considerable scrutiny on this case. What you're describing has been assessed, multiple times." He paused again. "Don't add anything further to her chart without physician authorization. That's not a request." "Or are you asking me to not document clinical observations?" "I'm asking you to understand your role." He hung up. Claire sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Then she documented the call. She wrote the time, the content, and the instruction she'd received. She kept it clinical and precise and attached it to the same file as her original observation. If this ever became a question of record, she wanted the sequence clear. She went back to room 317 at 4 a.m. Emily was the same. The general was still sleeping, though now his head had dropped forward at an angle that would hurt his neck when he woke up. Claire stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the hospital complex, the parking structure, the amber-lit walkways, a groundskeeper moving slowly across the wet grass in the dark. Then she looked back at Emily. She pulled out the small notebook she'd carried since her first deployment. Waterproof cover, spiral binding, the kind that fits in a cargo pocket. She started writing down everything she'd observed, in the order she'd observed it, with the exact times. Not for the hospital, for herself, because she'd been in situations before where the hospital record became contested, and the only version of the truth that survived was the one someone had written down independently before anyone thought to argue about it. Oh, morning came fast, the way it always does after a night shift. Suddenly, without warning, the light changing in the windows and the day staff beginning to arrive with their coffee cups and their louder voices and their ownership of the daytime space. Claire was finishing her final round when she heard the footsteps behind her. 2 sets, deliberate, coming from the elevator. Dr. Malcolm Reeves was shorter than she'd expected from his voice, compact, with silver gray hair and the kind of posture that announced itself in a room. He was moving with the particular energy of a man who had arranged this moment. The man beside him was Dr. Pryor, according to his badge, head of nursing administration. Bennett? Reeves stopped in the hallway 6 feet from her. I want to address last night's documentation. All right? Your notations in the Carter file have been removed. She kept her face still. They've been removed. They were speculative, unsupported, and potentially harmful to family relations at a critical juncture. The family is meeting with us at 8 o'clock to discuss end-of-life care options, and your notation created confusion that had to be managed. I documented what I observed. You documented a subjective impression during an unsupervised nighttime assessment. His voice stayed even and controlled, but she could hear the effort in it. Let me be direct. Your military experience is not equivalent to clinical neurological expertise. The Carter case is closed. If you enter that room again without explicit physician authorization, I'll escalate this to the licensing board. She looked at him steadily. Is there a formal written version of that instruction? Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly, but a recalibration. He wasn't used to that question. I'll have Dr. Pryor document it, he said, and I'd strongly suggest you use the remainder of your shift to consider whether this position is the right fit. They walked away. Claire stood in the hallway, breathing carefully. In through the nose, controlled, because that was the technique she'd used in places where losing composure cost more than dignity. It cost lives. She thought about Emily's hand, the flicker in the tendons, the micro-tremor at the eye corner that nobody had written down for 8 months. She thought about the 0800 meeting. Aunt. At 7:40 a.m., before the family arrived, Claire went back to room 317. She told herself she was doing a final nursing check before handoff. That was true enough. She checked the IV, the feeding line, the ventilator readings, all stable. General Carter was awake now, standing at the window in yesterday's clothes with a coffee cup that he wasn't drinking from. He didn't acknowledge her. That was fine. She stood at the bedside and looked at Emily again, and this time she leaned in slightly, close enough to speak quietly. I'm going to try something, she said. You don't have to do anything. Just let whatever's there keep going. From her bag, she removed a small device, slim, unremarkable looking, about the size of a thick pen. A neural vibration stimulator, the type developed through military medical research for patients with locked-in syndrome and traumatic neurological dissociation. It wasn't experimental exactly. It had been used in field conditions with documented outcomes. But it had never made it through the civilian approval channels in this country, which meant it existed in a gray space. Not illegal, not approved, technically available through military medical channels to personnel with the right training. Claire had the right training. She'd helped develop the protocol in her 3rd deployment. She placed the device carefully against Emily's left temple, adjusted the frequency, and activated it. The stimulation was gentle, imperceptible to anyone watching, no sound, no movement. Just a precise electromagnetic pulse at a frequency calibrated for neurological arousal in severely suppressed patients. She watched the monitor. 30 seconds. Nothing changed. A minute. General Carter turned from the window. She didn't look at him. 90 seconds. The heart rate monitor shifted. A small jump, 6 beats per minute, then settling. She watched the waveform. It was different, more organized. 2 minutes. Emily's right hand moved, not a tremor, not a reflex. The fingers extended slowly, deliberately, and then curled again. The motion of someone working out whether a command is getting through. General, Claire said quietly. He was already at the bedside. She heard him make a sound she didn't have a word for. Not a word, not a sob. Something that was both those things and neither. "Emily," he said, his voice rough and unsteady. "Em, can you hear me?" Emily's hand moved again, and then, slowly, with the effort of someone lifting something much heavier than it looked, her fingers closed around Claire's wrist. The grip was weak, barely there, but it was organized. It was intentional. The door burst open. "What the hell is going on in here?" Dr. Reeves was in the doorway, and behind him were two hospital security officers, and behind them was Dr. Pryor. And from the look on Reeves's face, he had been told something had happened and had arrived prepared to end it. "Remove her," Reeves pointed at Claire. "Now, she is not authorized to be in this room." The security officers stepped forward. General Carter didn't move. He was still looking at his daughter's hand, at the fingers wrapped loosely around the nurse's wrist, and his expression was the expression of a man recalculating everything he'd accepted as true. "Wait," he said. But the security officers were already moving, and Reeves was already pulling out his phone. And somewhere down the hall, the elevator was opening with the sound of voices. The 0800 family consultation team arriving exactly on schedule to tell a father his daughter wasn't coming back. Claire didn't pull away from Emily's grip. She stood still and let what was happening speak for itself, because she'd learned long ago that there are moments when the evidence is already present and the only question is whether anyone is willing to look at it. Emily's fingers tightened, small, barely measurable, but real. The security officer's hand closed around Claire's arm just above the elbow. Not rough, not yet, but with the kind of practiced firmness that communicated this wasn't optional. She didn't resist. She also didn't move. "Sir?" She spoke directly to the officer, not to Reeves, because Reeves wasn't the one touching her. "Give me 30 seconds. Ma'am, I need you to step away from the patient. 30 seconds. She kept her voice at the same level she used when a soldier was going into shock, and she needed his eyes on her instead of on whatever was happening to his body. Flat, present. Not asking, not commanding, just occupying the space where panic might otherwise go. "Look at the monitor." The officer looked. The heart rate that had been sitting at 44 beats per minute for the past 8 months was running at 61. The waveform on the EEG, which had been a flat, barely differentiated crawl since October, was doing something that even a non-clinician could identify as different. There were peaks. There was organization. It looked less like weather and more like language. "That doesn't mean," Reeves started. "She's gripping my wrist," Claire said, still quiet. Still not moving. Voluntarily. You can see it. The room had filled without anyone quite deciding to fill it. The family consultation team was in the doorway. 2 physicians and a social worker who had arrived expecting a very different kind of morning. Dr. Pryor had stopped near the foot of the bed. General Carter stood where he'd been standing, his coffee cup set down on the windowsill at some point, his full attention on his daughter's hand. Emily's grip hadn't loosened. If anything, in the last 2 minutes, the pressure had increased slightly, the unremarkable stubborn progress of a body relearning its own instructions. "This is a medical emergency," Reeves said, and his voice had shifted into the register he used when he wanted a room to reorganize around him. "This woman has administered an unauthorized procedure on a patient under my care, and I need—" "What procedure?" General Carter said. It wasn't loud. He didn't need it to be loud. Reeves turned toward him with the careful expression of someone managing a powerful variable. "General, I understand this is an emotional—" "What did she do?" Not a question. The syntax of a man accustomed to briefings, not conversations. Reeves looked at Claire. "Explain what you administered." "A neural vibration stimulation protocol," Claire said, "developed through USA MRIID research. It's used for severe neurological suppression in trauma patients, documented outcomes in locked-in syndrome, blast injury dissociation, prolonged coma states. I have my training certification. The device is mine, from my field kit. It's unauthorized for civilian use. It's not prohibited," Claire said. "It's not FDA approved for routine clinical use, which is different. No law was broken." That landed differently in the room than Reeves had wanted it to. One of the consultation physicians, an older man named Dr. Farrell, according to his badge, who had come in with the resignation of someone doing his 6th end-of-life consultation this month, was now standing beside the monitor and looking at it with an expression that had moved past skepticism into something more uncomfortable. He knew what he was looking at. Claire could tell from the way he'd stopped moving. "The EEG," Dr. Farrell said, to no one specific. "I see it," said the woman beside him. "When did this start?" 2 minutes before you arrived," Claire said. The grip preceded it by about 45 seconds. Emily's hand was still closed around her wrist. Reeves said, "We need to clear this room. We need to conduct a proper assessment before anyone makes any claims about—" "She moved on her own," General Carter said. He was looking at his daughter's face now. 20 minutes ago, she wasn't moving. I was watching her. "General, I strongly advise you to let us—" "Don't tell me what to do right now." Quiet. The kind of quiet that has weight in it. The room went still. Reeves understood, in that moment, that he'd lost control of the scene. Claire could see it in the micro-adjustment of his shoulders, the slight backward shift, the recalibration. He was a man who operated through institutional authority, and the institution was no longer arranged around him the way it had been 60 seconds ago. He looked at Claire with an expression she recognized. She'd seen it on officers who'd been contradicted in front of their units. It wasn't just anger. It was the specific fury of someone who had been publicly correct for a long time and had structured their entire professional identity around that correctness. "This isn't over," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." The next 4 hours were the kind of controlled chaos that happens when a medical situation reverses unexpectedly, and the institution hasn't built any procedural scaffolding for what to do when they've been wrong. Claire was escorted to the nursing administrator's office at 8:23 a.m. and asked to wait. She sat in a chair that was slightly too low for the desk across from it, the deliberate ergonomics of a room designed to make people feel like they were being interviewed, and she waited. She'd brought her notebook. She reviewed what she'd written during the night. She made additional notes. Dr. Pryor arrived at 8:51 and sat across from her with a yellow legal pad that he didn't write anything on. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. "That would be a change," she said. He absorbed that without visible reaction, which told her he'd heard worse today. "The situation with Emily Carter is being actively assessed. Dr. Farrell is leading a neurological reevaluation right now. Until that's complete, your status here is—" He paused, searching for a word. "Pending. Pending clearance or pending termination? Pending review." He set down his pen. "Claire, I'm not your enemy here. But what you did, using an unauthorized device on a patient without physician approval, I documented every observation I made last night. I flagged them through proper channels. I was told not to document further without authorization, which I was also told in a phone call that I documented. When the standard process was being used to prevent a patient from receiving appropriate evaluation, I used the tools I had available." She kept her voice even. "What would you have done?" "I would have escalated through proper channels." "I did. The proper channel called me at 3 a.m. and told me to stop writing things down." Another pause. Dr. Pryor picked up his pen and then set it down again. "Your license," he said. "I know. I know what it could do." She looked at him. "I also know what was going to happen at 8 o'clock this morning if I hadn't gone back into that room." He didn't answer that. She was kept in the office until 10:15 when a different administrator came in, someone from legal, no introduction given, who asked her a series of questions about the device, the protocol, her certification, the sequence of events. She answered everything accurately and completely. She didn't volunteer information that wasn't asked for, and she didn't omit anything that was. 11 years of military debrief protocol had made her extremely good at the narrow corridor between those two approaches. At 10:47, she was told she could leave the building but should remain available. She understood what that meant, suspended, informally, while they figured out which version of this story was going to be the official one. She went home. She showered, ate something she didn't taste, and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop and her notebook. She pulled up everything she had on record, her transfer documents, her certification for the neural stimulation protocol, the training records from her 3rd deployment, The published research outcomes from the USAMRIID study she'd participated in. She organized it into a folder, printed 2 copies, and put them in separate locations. Then she called her former commanding officer. Major Diane Westholt was currently stationed at Fort Bramley and answered on the second ring in the voice of someone who had been awake for a while. Bennett, I need to brief you on something. There was a short silence. Is this personal or professional? Both. It involves a patient, daughter of General Richard Carter. A longer silence. Richard Carter. Yes, ma'am. Tell me. Claire told her, all of it in order, without editorializing, the micro tremor, the phone call from Reeves, the documentation she'd made, the device, what had happened in the room, what was happening now. When she finished, Westholt said, "Where's your device now?" "With me. In my bag." "Keep it there. Don't hand it over voluntarily." A pause. "Claire." "Ma'am." "You did the right thing." "I know." "That's going to matter later. Right now, it's not going to feel like it matters." "I know that too." After she hung up, she sat for a while without doing anything. The kitchen was quiet. There was a tree outside the window that was doing its early spring thing, the pale green that looked almost yellow in certain light. And she looked at it and thought about Emily Carter's hand closing around her wrist, and the sound General Carter had made that she still didn't have a word for. She hadn't saved anyone. Not yet. Emily had shown responsiveness. That wasn't the same as recovery, but it was the difference between a door that was locked and a door that was locked with someone still pressing against it from the other side. The call from Riverview came at 2:30 p.m., not from Dr. Pryor. From the hospital's legal department, a woman who identified herself as Ms. Gallagher and who had the voice of someone reading from a prepared statement. "Ms. Bennett, I'm calling to inform you that Riverview Medical Institute has filed a formal complaint with the State Nursing Board regarding your conduct during your employment here. The complaint cites unauthorized administration of a non-approved medical device, falsification of—" "Stop," Claire said. A brief pause. "I'm sorry? Falsification of what? I'm sorry? You said falsification. Falsification of what specifically?" The pause was longer this time. "Of patient chart notations." Claire opened her notebook. "I documented clinical observations at 1:23 and 1:24 a.m., time-stamped, signed with my credentials. Those entries were subsequently removed by hospital administration before the attending physician's scheduled family consultation. I also documented a phone call at 3:17 a.m. in which the attending neurologist instructed me not to add further notations to the patient file. Would you like the exact wording I used in those entries?" Silence. "I have copies of everything," Claire continued. "Independent copies, maintained separately from the hospital system. I'd suggest that the language about falsification is something your legal team revisits before it goes anywhere official." Ms. Gallagher said she would pass that along and ended the call. Claire put the phone down. Her hands were steady. That was interesting. Not a relief, just an observation. Somewhere in the last 6 hours, the adrenaline had converted itself into something slower and more durable. She'd felt it before, in extended operations, when the acute danger phase passed, and what replaced it was the longer, quieter, more grinding work of staying oriented while everything remained uncertain. She made herself eat dinner. She went to bed early and slept poorly. At 4:15 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. "Room 317. She's asking for you." Claire stared at it. She typed back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "Night charge nurse Yolanda. I got your number from the transfer file. I'm not supposed to reach out, but—" "She said your name. Twice. I thought you should know." Claire sat on the edge of her bed in the dark. She thought about Dr. Pryor's carefully neutral face and Ms. Gallagher's prepared statement, and the formal complaint moving through the nursing board system right now with her name on it. She got dressed. The hospital at 4:30 a.m. was a different organism than it was during the day, its core functions visible in a way that daytime activity usually obscured. Claire went through the side entrance, the one that emergency staff used, where she still had her access badge from the previous night because no one had formally revoked it yet. Either they hadn't gotten to it, or they'd forgotten in the chaos of the day. She took the stairs. The third floor was quiet. Yolanda was at the nursing station, a broad-shouldered woman in her 40s with natural hair pulled back and the watchful expression of someone who had been doing this job long enough to know when something mattered. She didn't get up when Claire came in. She just nodded toward room 317. "How long has she been responsive?" Claire asked. "Started around 9 last night. Dr. Farrell was here until midnight. Yolanda paused. "He looked shaken, like actually shaken. I've worked with him for 6 years. I've never seen that." "What did he say?" "Not much. He ordered a full neurological battery for the morning, and he sat with the general for about an hour." She looked at Claire. "The general asked for you." "I heard him. Dr. Farrell said there were administrative complications." "There are." "I figured." Yolanda glanced down the hallway. "Look, I don't know what's going to happen with your complaint situation, but I've been watching that girl lie in that bed since last November. I was the one who changed her position every 2 hours so she wouldn't get sores. I talked to her, because that's what you do, even when nobody's listening. And when I came in at 11 last night and she had her eyes open." She stopped. "You should go in." Claire went in. Emily Carter's eyes were open, not the glassy, untracking openness of vegetative state, where the eyes move through a room without registering it. These eyes were searching. They moved to the door when Claire entered, and they found her face, and they stayed there. She looked exhausted, the way soldiers looked after a firefight, that particular combination of depletion and hyper-awareness, the body wrung out by its own survival. Her face was thinner than it should be for a 24-year-old. 8 months of nutritional maintenance rather than food will do that. General Carter was in the chair. He'd clearly been there all night, and he'd clearly been awake for most of it. He looked up when Claire came in, and something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not hostility, something harder to name. The look of a man reassessing an equation he thought he'd already solved. "She's been in and out," he said quietly. "More in the last 2 hours." Claire came to the bedside. Emily's eyes tracked her movement. "Hey," Claire said. She kept it simple, because simple was what the brain could process when it was rebuilding its own pathways. "I'm Claire. We met earlier. You were asleep for most of it." Emily's mouth moved. It took several seconds, and what came out was barely a sound. A breath with intention behind it, a syllable trying to form. "Don't push it," Claire said. "You don't need to talk yet. Just let it come." The mouth moved again. "Lair." Her name. Approximately. The consonants imprecise and the vowel too broad, but the shape of it was there. General Carter made a sound in the chair. Claire didn't look at him. "Yeah," she said. "That's me." She pulled up a stool and sat at the bedside level, so Emily wasn't having to track upward. "Can you squeeze my hand?" She offered her left hand. Emily's right hand moved slowly, with the lurching deliberateness of someone relearning a motion they'd done 10,000 times before. The fingers found Claire's palm. The grip was weak, weaker than the previous morning, actually, because now the effort had to be voluntary and sustained rather than reflexive. But it was organized. It was an answer. "Good," Claire said. "That's good." They stayed like that for a while. The monitor beeped at steady intervals. Outside the window, Silverbrook was beginning its pre-dawn reset. The first delivery trucks, the earliest commuters, the sky going from black to a deep gray blue. Claire noted Emily's breathing pattern, her eye movement, the occasional facial expression that crossed her features and then settled. She was processing. The lights were on and someone was home, and the house was in various states of repair. "She asked for you," General Carter said, "around midnight. She said your name, and I asked Yolanda if there was a nurse named Claire, and she said—" He stopped. "I didn't know you'd been suspended. Officially, it's a pending review." "Same thing." "Yes." "Reeves called me at 6 last night," he said. "He wanted me to understand the situation with your credentials. He was very concerned about my daughter's well-being." The flatness in his voice when he said that was a kind of judgment more precise than any anger would have been. He didn't mention that she'd opened her eyes 2 hours earlier. Claire looked at him. What did you say to him? I didn't say anything. I listened, and when he was finished, I thanked him for calling, and I hung up. He looked at his daughter. Then I called my former JAG officer. That was interesting. About what? About whether a hospital administrator can legally delete nursing chart entries made by a licensed professional. And? He's not entirely sure, but he said the liability implications are significant either way. General Carter's hands were clasped between his knees. He was looking at Emily, who had drifted towards sleep again, the natural sleep of someone genuinely resting, rather than the static absence of before. I want to understand what happened. All of it. From the beginning. It'll take a while to explain. I've been sitting in this room for 8 months, he said. I have time. Claire told him. She took it from the beginning of the night shift. The chart, the observation, the phone call from Reeves, the documentation she'd made, and that had been removed, the protocol, the sequence in the room that morning. She didn't editorialize and she didn't soften anything, including the fact that she'd come back into the room knowing it was a career risk and not knowing if it was going to work. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Why did you come back? He finally asked. Not aggressively. He actually wanted to know. Because I've watched people decide that a patient is finished before the patient has decided that. She looked at Emily's sleeping face. In the field, the medical decision and the patient's decision are sometimes in completely different places. The job is to figure out which one you're actually responding to. He nodded slowly, not like he was agreeing with a policy, like someone who had just found the specific piece of information that made a larger picture cohere. My JAG officer is going to make some calls tomorrow, he said. I want you to know that. I appreciate it. I'm not doing it as a favor, he said. I'm doing it because what happened in this room deserves a complete accounting, and the people responsible for removing evidence from a patient's medical record need to understand what that means. He said it the way he probably said most things, without ornamentation, in the direct register of someone who had spent a career meaning exactly what he said. Claire stayed for another hour. She watched Emily's breathing, checked the lines out of habit, updated her own notebook with timestamps and observations she would keep in her personal record. She was no longer employed here, or as good as not, and the documentation wasn't for the hospital. It was for whatever came next. At 6:10 a.m., she stood to leave. Bennett, General Carter said. She stopped. When this is sorted out, he paused. She's going to need someone in her corner who actually knows what they're doing. She has a long road. I know. He looked up at her. I'm not asking you to commit to anything right now. I'm just saying, when it's sorted. Claire nodded once and left. Chad. The sorted part took longer than she'd hoped and shorter than she'd feared. What she didn't know, walking out of the hospital in the early morning light, was that Dr. Farrell had spent the previous evening making his own phone calls, not to hospital administration, to colleagues, to the specialist who'd done the 4th neurological evaluation in November, to a researcher at a university program who studied disorders of consciousness and had published work on exactly the kind of prolonged suppression Emily had been experiencing. She also didn't know that Yolanda had been keeping a personal record since December, informal, handwritten, in a notebook she kept in her locker, of small things she'd observed in room 317 that had never made it into the official chart. Shifts in Emily's color. The occasional movement she'd documented as possible autonomic response, unconfirmed. A night in January when she'd been almost certain Emily had reacted to a sound in the hallway, but when she'd mentioned it at morning handoff, she'd been told to note it as inconclusive, no clinical significance. She didn't know yet that Major Westholt had made 3 calls before 7 a.m. that morning. What she did know was that her phone rang at 8:45 while she was sitting in a coffee shop 2 blocks from her apartment trying to eat a bagel and not think too hard about what came next. She didn't recognize the number. Ms. Bennett, a man's voice, measured, slightly formal, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who'd learned to use telephones professionally before they became ubiquitous. My name is Colonel Paul Drennan. I'm calling from the Army Surgeon General's office. I understand you used a field protocol yesterday morning at Riverview Medical Institute. Yes, she said. The protocol is on our approved field list. You're certified. Yes. And the outcome was, he paused, significant. Yes. I've been asked to reach out to you by General Carter's office. A brief pause. We'd like to understand the full picture of what happened, not just the clinical aspect, the administrative aspect as well. Claire looked at her bagel. That's a longer conversation. I have time, Colonel Drennan said. And Ms. Bennett, I want to be clear that this call is being made in an official capacity. Whatever you tell me is going into a formal record. Good, she said. That's what I want. She pushed the bagel aside and opened her notebook. Outside the coffee shop window, a city bus went past with an advertisement on its side, something bright and forgettable. And a woman walking a dog stopped to let it cross. And the morning went about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that 2 blocks away and 1 floor up, in a hospital room, a young woman who had been declared beyond recovery was sleeping her first real sleep in 8 months. And in an administrator's office on the 4th floor of that same building, Dr. Malcolm Reeves was being handed a phone by his assistant, and the voice on the other end was not the one he'd been expecting, and the expression that crossed his face as he listened was the expression of a man who had just realized for the first time that the ground beneath him had been shifting for longer than he knew. He didn't say anything for almost 30 seconds. Then, I see. Then nothing. The assistant, watching from the doorway, would later describe his face as the face of someone who had... Ope Reeves sat with the phone against his ear for another few seconds after the call ended, not moving, not setting it down, just holding it the way people hold things when their hands haven't caught up to the situation yet. His assistant, a young man named Todd, who had worked for him for 2 years and had learned to read the room with the precision of someone whose job depended on it, quietly pulled the door closed from the outside. He didn't ask if Reeves needed anything. He just disappeared, which was the correct instinct. Reeves set the phone down. He opened his laptop and looked at the Emily Carter file. The current version, the one that reflected the morning's developments, which Dr. Farrell had updated at 11 p.m. the previous night with language that was clinical and precise and that managed, in its careful neutrality, to be an indictment of everything that had come before it. Words like significant voluntary motor response and apparent reversal of suppressive state and prior assessment methodology warrants review sat in the document like stones someone had placed deliberately on a path to make sure you felt each one. He closed the laptop. He had built his reputation over 23 years on a specific kind of certainty, not arrogance. He'd never thought of it as arrogance, but the practiced confidence of someone who had been right more often than he'd been wrong, and had learned to move quickly because hesitation cost patience. That was the story he'd told himself. The efficient physician, the one who made the hard calls. He reached for his phone again, then stopped. Whatever call he was about to make, he needed to think about who was already on the other end of lines he didn't control. Colonel Drennan arrived at Riverview Medical Institute at 11:20 a.m. the following day with 2 people Claire hadn't been introduced to and didn't ask about, because their body language communicated their function clearly enough. They went directly to the administrative conference room on the 4th floor, and they brought with them a case that contained equipment for secure document review, which told Claire that whatever this was, it had been organized faster than she'd expected. She had been asked to come in, not by hospital administration, by Drennan's office directly, through a call that had been specific about the time and the parking entrance, and had mentioned, without being asked, that her temporary access badge would work. Someone had made a decision about her status before anyone had officially communicated it. She sat across the conference table from Drennan and told the whole thing again, this time with her documentation in front of her, the printed folder she'd assembled the previous afternoon. Drennan's colleagues recorded the session on equipment that was not hospital issue, and one of them asked occasional questions that were short and precise and revealed, in their specificity, that they'd already reviewed a significant amount of background material before walking into this room. When she finished, Drennan looked at the documentation for a moment without speaking. "Your certification is current," he said. "Yes." "The device is on the field-approved list. You followed the protocol." "Yes." "And the chart entries that documented your initial observations were removed by hospital administration before the family consultation." "I have the original timestamps from my personal log. They predate the removal." Drennan looked at the woman to his right, who nodded once. We're going to need the original device, he said. Not to confiscate, to document the usage record. It logs session data. I know, it's in my bag. She reached in and set it on the table. Drennan looked at it for a moment. It was unremarkable, matte gray, the size of a fat marker, with a small indicator light and a flat contact surface. It looked like something a person might use to check tire pressure. Dr. Farrell's evaluation was completed this morning, he said. I haven't seen it. No, you wouldn't have. He paused. Emily Carter's neurological state is consistent with a condition called prolonged functional dissociation following traumatic neurological insult. It's documented in the literature. Rare, but documented. In this state, voluntary brain activity is present but decoupled from the motor and communication systems. The patient is cognitively present but physiologically locked. He watched her face. You knew that. I suspected it, based on the microtremors and the motor response patterns. 17 specialists evaluated her over 8 months and none of them caught it. They weren't looking for it. They'd already agreed on the answer. Drennan was quiet for a moment. That's a significant statement. It's what the record shows. He nodded, once, slowly. Ms. Bennett, I want to be clear about where this goes from here. What happened in that room, both what you did and what was done to your documentation, constitutes a set of events with medical, administrative, and potentially legal dimensions. The Army Surgeon General's office has an interest because the protocol you used is ours and because General Carter has formally requested a review. That review is now underway. What does that mean for the complaint against my license? It means, Drennan said, that the State Nursing Board has been made aware that the complaint was filed by the same administrative body that deleted clinical chart entries. They're aware of the sequence. Their process will run its course, but I'd suggest you're not in the most precarious position in this room. He said it without satisfaction, just as a fact, in the same register as everything else. Dr. Farrell found Claire in the hallway outside room 317 at 1:30 that afternoon. He was a man who had clearly slept poorly for 2 nights. His eyes had the grainy look of someone running on inadequate rest and too much coffee, and he stopped in front of her without the elaborate professional composure that physicians usually deployed when talking to nurses they outranked. I owe you something, he said. You don't owe me anything. I was in that consultation team. The morning you... He stopped. I'd reviewed her file the night before. I came in at 8, expecting to talk a father through withdrawal of care. He looked at the closed door of room 317. I've been doing this for 26 years. I've sat with a lot of families in a lot of rooms. And I had looked at that file and I had agreed with the consensus, because the consensus was well documented and there were a lot of names attached to it. And he didn't finish that sentence. Dr. Farrell, I should have caught it, he said. Not necessarily in the first evaluation, but at some point in 8 months, someone should have looked more carefully. He wasn't asking for absolution. He seemed to be saying it because the weight of it needed somewhere to go. I've put in a formal request for a complete review of the diagnostic record. Every evaluation, every notation, every decision point. That's going to be uncomfortable for a lot of people. Yes. He met her eyes. It should be. He left. Claire stood in the hallway for a moment and thought about what he'd said and what he hadn't said. He hadn't defended himself beyond acknowledging the failure, which was more than most people managed. She didn't know what it cost him exactly, but she could estimate. She pushed open the door to room 317. Emily was awake. Not the semi-conscious drifting of the previous night. She was properly awake, sitting up at a slight incline with the bed adjusted behind her. A speech therapist Claire didn't recognize seated beside her working through basic verbal exercises. General Carter was in his usual chair, but he'd changed clothes, which suggested he'd gone home at some point and come back, and the lines in his face looked fractionally less deep than they had 2 days ago. Emily tracked Claire's entrance. Her eyes found her immediately, with the same searching focus as the previous night. Hey, Claire said. Emily's mouth formed something. The speech therapist, whose badge said R. Okafor, nodded encouragingly. The word that came out was slow and imprecise, but unmistakable. You. Not a question. An identification. Yeah, Claire said. Me. Something in Emily's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, her face was still too depleted for that, but a softening. The recognition of someone who'd been in the dark and remembered a specific sound from before the dark. "We don't need to talk now," Claire said. "There's time." Emily's hand moved slightly against the bed rail. Her fingers tapped it twice, not randomly, deliberately, a gesture that communicated, understood. She was still in there, had been in there, 8 months, and the whole time. Claire stayed for 20 minutes, observing, noting Emily's responsiveness, the range of motion she was beginning to recover in her right hand, the way her eyes tracked across a room and processed what they saw with increasing organization. She was going to need months of intensive rehabilitation. Her muscle tone was severely degraded. Her speech would require sustained therapy. The road ahead was long and difficult, and there would be setbacks. None of that changed what it was. She was leaving when General Carter said her name. She turned. "Drennan's people are meeting with hospital administration at 3 o'clock, he said. "I've asked my JAG officer to be present." "That's a fast timeline." "I made some calls." He looked at his daughter. "I spent 8 months being told to be patient. I'm not feeling patient. Walk." The 3 p.m. meeting happened on the 4th floor without Claire in the room, which was appropriate. She wasn't a party to the administrative proceedings, just the person who'd triggered them. She knew it was happening because Yolanda texted her a single line at 3:47. Reeves didn't come out for his 3:30 consult, sent his resident. At 4:15, Dr. Pryor's assistant called to ask if Claire could come in at 9 the following morning. "For what purpose?" Claire asked. "Dr. Pryor would like to discuss your employment status." "My employment status?" she repeated. "Yes." "Will there be anyone else at that meeting?" A pause. "I believe Colonel Drennan's office will have a representative present." She said she'd be there. She spent the evening at home going over everything she'd documented, not because she expected to need it, the shape of what was coming was becoming clear, but because that was how she processed things, organized, reviewed, filed. Her apartment was not a particularly warm space. She'd moved in 6 months ago, when she'd taken the Riverview position, and most of her furniture was still the functional but minimal kind that people buy when they're not sure how long they'll be somewhere. A couch, a kitchen table, a decent lamp, books that were still mostly in boxes. Military habits. Don't invest in a space you might leave. She sat at the kitchen table and thought about Emily Carter saying you with the specific weight of someone who has been waiting to say it. She thought about what Drennan had said, prolonged functional dissociation. A condition in the literature documented real, that 8 months of consensus had collectively not considered because the consensus was self-reinforcing, not necessarily malicious at the start. The first evaluation had probably been genuine and thorough and wrong, and then each subsequent evaluation had unconsciously oriented itself around the existing conclusion because that was what humans did with complex information under time pressure. They weighted prior agreement heavily. The malicious part had come later. The phone call at 3 a.m., the deleted entries, the formal complaint filed within 12 hours of her being proven right. That part hadn't been confusion. That had been a choice. She went to bed at 10 and lay in the dark thinking about it, not anxiously, just with the clear-eyed awareness of someone watching a process unfold that hadn't finished unfolding yet. Her phone buzzed at 11:50 p.m. It was a number she recognized. The hospital's main line routed through the night desk. She answered. "Ms. Bennett." It was Yolanda. Her voice was different from the previous call, tighter, controlled, the voice of someone managing themselves carefully around something that wanted to be bigger. "I need you to know something before tomorrow morning." "What is it?" "I found something in the supply log." A pause. "I wasn't looking for it. I was doing the monthly inventory cross-check, but..." Another pause. 2 of the medications in Emily Carter's long-term care protocol. The dosages in the pharmaceutical dispensing record don't match the dosages in the physician's order chart. Claire sat up. "By how much?" she asked. "The sedation component. It's been running about 15% higher than ordered, every week since February." Yolanda's voice was very careful. "For 4 months, she's been receiving more sedative than any doctor signed off on." The room was quiet. Claire could hear her own breathing. "Who has dispensing authority on that protocol?" she asked. "It runs through the attending physician's standing order, which means who countersigns the dispensing log?" A pause. "Reeves," Yolanda said. "It's always been Reeves." Claire's hand tightened on the phone. The condition Farrell had described, prolonged functional dissociation, could be triggered by a traumatic neurological event, but it could also be maintained, deepened. A patient on the threshold of consciousness could be kept there with the right pharmaceutical combination, in doses just high enough to suppress voluntary motor function, but not high enough to appear on a standard toxicology screen as sedation, 15% above the ordered dose, every week for 4 months. Emily Carter hadn't just been misdiagnosed. Someone had been making sure she stayed that way. "Yolanda," Claire said, "don't touch that log. Don't move it. Don't copy it. Don't tell anyone you found it. I need you to secure it exactly where it is right now." "I already photographed it with my personal phone." "Good. Send it to me. And then call Colonel Drennan's office. The number should be in the administrative contact file from today's meeting. Tell them what you told me in exactly those words." She paused. "And Yolanda, this goes to them first, not to Pryor, not to anyone in hospital administration." A beat of silence. "I've known something was wrong with this case since January," Yolanda said. "I just didn't know what." "You know now." After she hung up, Claire sat in the dark with the phone in her hand and let the full shape of it settle. This wasn't negligence that had calcified into cover-up. This was something that had been a decision from somewhere, a decision to prevent Emily Carter from recovering, or at minimum, a decision to keep her in a state where she couldn't contradict whatever story was being managed around her. She didn't know the full why yet, but the pharmaceutical record was specific and time-stamped, and it would take a forensic audit approximately 48 hours to establish a chain of custody that pointed in one direction. What she did know was this. Dr. Malcolm Reeves had called her at 3 a.m. and told her to stop writing things down. He had filed a complaint against her license within hours of his patient proving him wrong. And for 4 months, sedative levels in Emily Carter's dispensing log had been running above what any physician had authorized, countersigned by his name. The 9 a.m. meeting tomorrow was going to be a different meeting than Pryor's assistant had described. She put her phone on the table and looked at it, and thought about the way Reeves had said this isn't over in room 317 2 mornings ago, looking at her with that specific fury of a man whose professional certainty had been publicly contradicted. He'd been right about that part at least. It wasn't over, not even close. Her phone screen lit up with an incoming image. Yolanda's photograph of the dispensing log, 4 months of entries, the numbers sitting in their columns with the unremarkable precision of something that had been maintained carefully by someone who believed no one would ever look at it this closely. Claire enlarged the image and looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she opened a new document on her laptop and started writing, because whatever happened at 9 tomorrow morning, she was going to walk into that room with a complete record, and the record was going to speak before anyone in that room had the chance to decide what language they wanted to use. Outside, Silverbrook had gone fully quiet. The late-night quiet of a city between its last people and its first ones. That narrow window where everything that was going to happen tomorrow hadn't started yet. Inside room 317, 3 floors up and 2 blocks away, a young woman who had spent 4 months being quietly, deliberately kept under was sleeping the unmedicated sleep of someone whose body was finally running on its own terms. And somewhere in this building, in an office, or a car, or a house where a phone had rung with news he hadn't been prepared for, a man was sitting with the knowledge that the dispensing log existed and that someone had found it, and trying to calculate whether there was still a version of tomorrow where that didn't mean what it meant. There wasn't. Ned. A door expecting a familiar room and found instead that the floor was gone. She was still at the kitchen table at 2 a.m. when her laptop screen showed 43 pages of notes. Not 43 pages of narrative. 43 pages of sequence, time-stamped, cross-referenced, built the way she'd been trained to build after-action reports when the situation was complex enough that a single thread wouldn't hold the full weight of what had happened. She had the pharmaceutical discrepancy at the center and everything else radiating out from it. The original chart entries and their deletion, the 3 a.m. phone call, The formal complaint filed within 12 hours of Emily's response. The 8 months of evaluations that had collectively missed a treatable condition, and now the dispensing log with 4 months of above-ordered sedation countersigned by the same name. She printed it. Both copies, separate locations. Then she shut the laptop and went to bed and slept 4 hours, which was enough. At 8:40 a.m., she was in the parking structure adjacent to Riverview, sitting in her car when Colonel Drennan called. "We received Nurse Okafor's message at 1:15 this morning," he said. "We've had 2 people reviewing the pharmaceutical records since 4 a.m. And the discrepancy is consistent across 19 weeks. The dispensing records show a sedative concentration running between 12 and 17% above the physician's standing order. The variance is too regular to be error." He paused. "It's also too targeted. The sedative in question, in these concentrations, over this duration, would have a specific effect on a patient in the neurological state Emily Carter presented with." "Suppression maintenance," Claire said. "That's the clinical term, yes." She looked at the concrete pillar in front of her car. "Who else knows about the log?" "As of this morning, my team, Nurse Okafor, you, and whoever Okafor may have spoken to at the hospital. We've advised her to treat it as a sealed matter." "Is the log secure?" "A copy is in our possession. The original has been photographically documented and will be secured this morning through the hospital's compliance office, bypassing administrative channels." Bypassing administrative channels. That meant someone had already determined that the administrative channels were part of the problem. "The 9 o'clock meeting," she said, "will proceed as scheduled, but the agenda has changed." A pause. "Ms. Bennett, I'd like you to be in that room, not as an employee seeking reinstatement, as a witness in an active inquiry." "I understand the difference." "I thought you would." She ended the call, sat for another minute, then got out of the car. The 4th-floor conference room looked different with 9 people in it. Dr. Pryor was there, and he had clearly been told enough to know that whatever he'd planned for this meeting was no longer what this meeting was. His yellow legal pad was in front of him, but he hadn't opened it. Beside him sat Riverview's general counsel, a woman named Ms. Hargrove, who had the contained, watchful posture of someone doing rapid assessment of shifting liability terrain. Colonel Drennan sat across from them with his 2 colleagues and a third person Claire hadn't seen before, a woman in civilian clothes who had the efficient economy of movement that suggested military background without the uniform. General Carter's JAG officer, a man named Major Tillman, sat at the far end of the table with a leather folder that he kept closed in front of him. Claire sat beside Drennan. Reeves was not in the room. That was the first thing she noticed, and it told her something had already moved without her. Drennan opened without preamble. "This meeting was originally scheduled to address Miss Bennett's employment status. It's been expanded to include findings from an administrative review initiated yesterday and accelerated based on additional evidence received overnight." He set a thin folder on the table. "I'll be direct. The pharmaceutical dispensing records for patient Emily Carter, room 317, show a consistent sedative dosage exceeding physician-ordered levels over a 19-week period. Those records bear a counter-signature that identifies the authorizing physician. That physician is Dr. Malcolm Reeves." Ms. Hargrove's pen stopped moving. Pryor said nothing. His face had the careful stillness of someone who had received this information earlier and was now watching how it landed in a room with more people in it. "The State Medical Board has been notified," Drennan continued. "As of 7 a.m. this morning, Dr. Reeves has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. He was informed by Dr. Pryor at 6:45. Claire thought about the 40-minute gap between that notification and this meeting. 40 minutes for a man to sit with the knowledge that the dispensing log had been found. "What's his current location?" she asked. Drennan glanced at her. "His office, with hospital security present. Per legal advice, he's been asked to remain on the premises until investigators from the State Medical Board arrive at 10 o'clock. He agreed to that? His attorney advised him to comply. She nodded. Okay. Pryor cleared his throat. I want to state for the record that hospital administration had no knowledge of the pharmaceutical discrepancy prior to Dr. Pryor. Major Tillman's voice was quiet and precise. I'd recommend you save those statements for the formal inquiry. Anything you say in this room is part of the official record. He let that sit for a second. That applies to everyone at this table. Pryor closed his mouth. Hargrove looked at her notepad. She was doing the math, the institutional math, the liability arithmetic that happens when a building realizes it has been moving in a direction and needs to calculate how far it went before it can figure out the cost of stopping. Drennan turned to Claire. Ms. Bennett, the complaint filed against your nursing license has been withdrawn, Hargrove said. She said it the way someone tears off a bandage, quick, with a practiced neutrality that made it sound like a procedural correction rather than an admission of anything. The hospital is withdrawing the complaint effective this morning. I've drafted a notice to the state nursing board. It will go out before 11. Claire looked at her. The complaint cited falsification of chart entries. Yes. The entries I made were accurate, time-stamped, and subsequently deleted by hospital administration. Yes. Hargrove met her eyes. The hospital acknowledges that. In writing, a pause. In writing, Claire nodded once. She didn't say anything else about it. The acknowledgement was in the room, on the record, and that was what it needed to be. Drennan moved through the remaining items efficiently. The formal review of Emily Carter's diagnostic record would be conducted by an independent panel. Claire's personal documentation, her notebook, her printed logs, would be submitted as part of that record. The neural stimulation protocol she'd used had been reviewed and found to be within her training authorization and not in violation of any law or regulation. The meeting ended at 9:52 a.m. As people were gathering their materials, Pryor caught Claire's eye across the table. She expected something, an apology maybe, or the administrative equivalent of one, something carefully phrased that acknowledged the minimum while protecting the institution. What she got instead was a long look in which she could see him calculating something privately, a reckoning he was conducting with himself that wasn't finished yet. He nodded. Small. Acknowledged. She picked up her folder and left. No. The state medical board investigators arrived in a 2-car convoy at 10:07 a.m. and went directly to the 4th floor. Claire watched from the hallway near the elevator, not lingering, just noting, the way you noted the arrival of a relief unit when you'd been holding a position and help was finally coming from the right direction. What happened in Reeves' office in the next 2 hours, she heard in fragments from Yolanda, who heard it from the ward clerk, who heard it from the administrative assistant who worked the 4th floor desk and had been in the building when it happened. Reeves had his attorney present by the time investigators arrived. He was composed, according to the assistant, the same controlled, formal composure he used in difficult patient conversations, the performance of measured authority. He answered the initial questions about the dispensing log by suggesting a documentation error, a system glitch, a transcription issue that would require technical review to fully understand. Then the investigator showed him the pattern. 19 weeks, week over week, consistent variance within a tight range, the kind of pattern that doesn't appear in system errors, which tend to cluster or spike rather than maintain. The kind that only comes from human repetition of a specific choice. The composition slipped, according to the assistant. Not dramatically. Reeves wasn't someone who did things dramatically, but there was a shift, a recalibration, the quality of someone internally reassessing which version of the story had any remaining runway. He stopped answering questions at 11:30 and asked for additional time with his attorney. Investigators requested that the time be used for a specific purpose, preparing a complete and accurate accounting of the pharmaceutical decisions, their authorization, and whether any other medical personnel had knowledge of them. The request went in as a courtesy. What it communicated was not. Claire heard this account piecemeal, standing at the nurse's station on the 3rd floor while she updated the formal clinical notes she'd been asked to contribute to Emily's new care record. She kept writing through it, not because she was indifferent, but because that was how she was built. The event could be significant, and the documentation could still happen simultaneously. At 12:15, Yolanda came and stood beside her. They found something else, she said quietly. Claire kept writing. What? In his email archive. The investigators requested it from the hospital's IT system. There's a chain going back to March, between Reeves and the lead neurologist from the November consultation, the one who did the 3rd evaluation. What does the chain say? Yolanda was quiet for a second. I don't know the full content, but the admin assistant heard the investigators mention coordinated documentation and agreed prognosis language. Claire's pen stopped. Agreed prognosis language. That was a specific phrase. It meant the evaluations hadn't just converged organically on the same conclusion. The language used to reach that conclusion had been aligned in advance. She thought about the 4 specialist reports she'd read on Emily Carter's file. She'd thought at the time that they were remarkably similar in their wording. She'd attributed it to professional consensus and shared clinical vocabulary. It hadn't been coincidence. How many people knew? She asked. That I don't know, Yolanda said. But the email chain has multiple recipients. The rest of that afternoon moved with the particular momentum of an investigation that has found solid ground and is now moving across it quickly. Claire stayed on the 3rd floor, focused on Emily. It was deliberate. Whatever was happening on the 4th floor was real, and it was necessary, and it was completely out of her hands, and she had learned the specific skill of removing her attention from processes she couldn't control in order to focus on the one in front of her. The one in front of her was a 24-year-old woman relearning how to use her own body. Emily's second day of real consciousness was harder than the first in ways that mattered. The previous day's lucidity had come in waves, sustained by the novelty of returning function. Today, the reality was settling. The stiffness in limbs that hadn't moved voluntarily in 8 months. The frustration of words that formed in her mind and arrived in her mouth only partially assembled. The exhaustion that came from asking muscles to do things they'd forgotten. Renata Okafor, the speech therapist, was working with her at 2 p.m. when Claire came in. Emily had graduated from single words to short phrases, which was faster than expected and said something about the structural integrity of her language processing. Whatever had been suppressed, not destroyed. She was working on a sentence when Claire sat down. Her brow was furrowed with the effort of it. I was... She stopped, frustrated. Her jaw tightened. Take a breath, Renata said. Don't chase it. Emily breathed, then, I was there, the whole time. The sentence was effortful and the syntax was slightly off and the delivery was fragmented. It was also completely clear. Renata made a note. General Carter, in his chair, made no sound. I know, Claire said. I heard, Emily paused, reorganizing. I heard them, talking, about me. Claire kept her face even. What did you hear? In the beginning, before she touched her own face lightly, the gesture of someone trying to locate a sensation. Before it got darker, before the pharmaceutical suppression increased, before February. You don't have to tell me now, Claire said. I want to. Emily's eyes were very clear, exhausted and frustrated and clear. I want to say it. While I remember. Okay, Claire said, then say it. It took 40 minutes, not because Emily didn't know what she wanted to say. She did, she knew exactly, but because the mechanism of saying it was still being rebuilt. Claire sat and listened and didn't rush her and didn't fill in her words when she stalled, which was its own kind of discipline because every instinct said to help, and the help would have been wrong. What Emily described, haltingly and with growing precision as her brain warmed to the task, was a consciousness that had been present and unreachable simultaneously. The awareness of voices in the room, words filtering through at varying clarity, the sensation of her own body as a closed space, signals sent and received and not completing, the specific quality of the darkness deepening in February, a heaviness, a compression, the sense of being further away from the surface of herself without understanding why. She described a conversation she'd heard in March. 2 voices, one of which she recognized as Reeves, discussing her case in language that had struck her, even in her diminished state, as wrong. Not clinical. Something else. He said... Emily stopped. Her hands were in her lap and she was looking at them. He said it was better this way. For now. She looked up. I didn't, understand. Better for who? The room was quiet. General Carter was very still in his chair. "That's enough for today," Claire said. "No." Emily's voice was thin but firm. I need to say it. It needs to," she searched for the word, "be real, outside my head." "It's real," Claire said. "I'm writing it down." She was. Her notebook was open on her knee and she was writing in the same precise time-stamped format she'd used for everything else, because Emily Carter had just described, in her own words, overhearing a conversation that moved this from pharmaceutical negligence into something with a sharper legal edge. General Carter stood up. Not quickly. He unfolded from the chair with the deliberate control of a man keeping himself in check by force of will. He walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room. "Yolanda," Claire said. Yolanda appeared in the doorway. She'd been in the hallway, not lurking, just present in the way she'd been present on this floor for 4 months, part of the furniture that actually cared. "Can you ask Colonel Drennan to come to room 317? Tell him Ms. Carter has a statement she'd like to make." Yolanda was already gone before the sentence was finished. Drennan came with the third person from his team, the woman in civilian clothes, whose name Claire had by now established was Dr. Vera Hollis, a medical ethics investigator with the Army Surgeon General's office. They set up a small recorder on the bedside table with Emily's explicit consent, and they listened while Emily said again, more smoothly this time, because the second iteration was always easier, what she'd described to Claire. Drennan asked 3 questions, all of them short and precise. Hollis asked 2. Neither of them asked leading questions, and neither of them showed any visible reaction to the content, which was its own kind of professionalism. When Emily finished, Drennan said, "Thank you, Ms. Carter. I want you to know that what you've told us is significant. You have the right to formal representation in this process." Emily nodded. She looked wrung out. The sustained effort of the conversation had cost her, and she was listing slightly against the elevated mattress. "Is she going to be protected?" General Carter asked. He turned from the window at some point and was standing at the foot of the bed. "From whatever happens next. Is she protected?" "General, I can tell you that the investigation is now significantly broader than a pharmaceutical discrepancy. What Ms. Carter has described constitutes potential criminal conduct. That moves this outside the state medical board's jurisdiction and into law enforcement territory." "That's not what I asked." Drennan met his eyes. "Yes, she's protected." The general looked at his daughter. Emily looked back at him. 8 months of a room where he'd talked and she'd been unable to answer, and now she was looking at him with the clear, exhausted eyes of someone who had been in a very long silence and was finding her way back through it, one word at a time. He sat on the edge of her bed. He put his hand over hers. He didn't say anything. Claire left them there. Look, by 4:30 p.m., 3 things happened in rapid enough succession that they felt like one thing. First, the State Medical Board investigators formally suspended Reeves' medical license, effective immediately, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation that had been opened by the County District Attorney's Office at 3:45 p.m. He was escorted from the building, not in handcuffs, not yet, but with the specific deliberateness of an escort that wanted the distinction to be clear that he was leaving and not returning. His attorney walked beside him with the expression of someone doing rapid repackaging of every argument he'd prepared. Second, Dr. Farrell was asked to take over Emily Carter's care on an interim basis, pending the appointment of a new lead physician. He accepted. He also, in his first act in that role, formally requested the independent neurological panel that he'd mentioned to Claire in the hallway the previous day. He requested it with his own name on it, which meant putting his professional standing behind the assessment that every prior evaluation had missed something treatable. Third, hospital administration, Dr. Pryor, Ms. Hargrove, and 2 board members who had materialized from somewhere with the urgency of people who've just been told a pipe has burst, issued a statement to hospital staff that described the situation with the studied vagueness of institutions caught mid-crisis. The statement acknowledged an administrative and clinical review, described personnel changes, and said the hospital was cooperating fully with all relevant inquiries. It said nothing about Claire. She read it standing at the nurses' station on the 3rd floor, and she noticed what wasn't there, and she noted it in her notebook. That evening at 6:30, she was back in the parking structure in her car, writing up the day's sequence when her phone rang. General Carter. "I want to say something," he said. No preamble. "Okay." When security was moving in that morning, when Reeves was telling them to remove you. A pause. I hesitated. She waited. "You had your hand on my daughter's wrist and she was gripping it, and I could see it, and I still..." For about 2 seconds, I looked at him, and I looked at you, and I weighed the institutional authority in the room, and I hesitated. 2 seconds isn't a hesitation, she said. 2 seconds is a human response time. I should have been faster. You said wait. You did say it. After 2 seconds. She understood what he was doing, not seeking forgiveness, not looking for reassurance, giving her the honest account of his own failure, in the same direct register he used for everything else, because that was how he processed things that cost him something. I've hesitated before, she said. In worse situations, with higher stakes. And usually the 2 seconds is when you're making the correct decision without knowing it yet. She looked at the concrete pillar in front of her car. You said wait. The right word, at the right time. That's what it needed. A long pause. My JAG officer tells me, he said, that the emails between Reeves and the November neurologist reference a third party, someone outside the hospital who had an interest in Emily's prolonged status. Claire's hand tightened on the phone. The November neurologist, she said carefully. Dr. Varner. Varner. Who is the third party? That, he said, is what investigators are trying to determine as of this afternoon. His attorney is cooperating under an agreement that's being finalized right now. She thought about that. A third party with an interest in Emily's prolonged status. Not medical interest. Something else. Emily Carter was 24 years old, the daughter of a retired general, and she'd been in an 8-month coma that someone had been chemically maintaining. What does Emily stand to inherit? She asked. A silence that was its own kind of answer. She's the sole beneficiary of her maternal grandmother's estate, he said. It's held in trust pending a competency determination. Grandmother died in October, 2 months before the November evaluation. The October death, the November consultation, the language alignment in the evaluations, the February increase in sedation. Claire did the arithmetic. Who benefits from the trust if Emily is declared incompetent? She asked. A secondary beneficiary, he said. A financial management firm. One with a board member who, it turns out, has a personal relationship with a former colleague of Dr. Varner's. The shape of it was there now. Not a medical conspiracy, something more mercenary and more ordinary than that. A trust, a timing, an opportunity that required a patient to remain unconscious. Reeves hadn't invented it. He'd been given the shape of what was needed and had used his institutional authority to provide it, and the financial benefit had been structured carefully enough that it didn't touch him directly. Is this going to the DA? She asked. It's already there, he said. Has been since about 2 o'clock. She exhaled. Claire. He used her first name. First time. I need to ask you something directly. Okay? When all of this is resolved, the investigation, the board, the criminal proceedings, when Emily is clear and the people responsible are accountable. A pause. Would you be willing to lead her rehabilitation, long-term, whatever it requires? She looked out through the windshield at the concrete and the fluorescent parking structure lights and the ordinary dusk visible through the open side of the structure. That's not a small commitment, she said. No. Neurological rehabilitation from prolonged suppression, with the added complication of what she experienced while she was conscious and unreachable. That's going to be, I know what it's going to be, he said. I'm asking because you're the only person in that building who looked at her and saw what was actually there. She thought about Emily's hand around her wrist, the word you spoken with the weight of someone who'd been waiting to say it. Yes, she said. She was about to end the call when he said, There's one more thing. Something in his tone shifted, slightly. The specific shift of someone moving from a conversation they've controlled into one where they're less certain of the ground. The financial management firm, he said. The secondary beneficiary. Another pause. One of its board members. The one connected to Varner. Yes. He's also on Riverview Medical Institute's board of directors. The parking structure was very quiet. Since when? She asked. Since 2019, he said. He's been on the hospital's board for 4 years, which means he had visibility into hospital administration, medical department decisions, personnel matters, staff scheduling, she said. A silence. Who put me on the night shift? She asked, though she was already understanding the answer before he gave it. Reeves made the schedule. You said that the first night. Reeves made the schedule himself. Yes. Night shift. Wing C, long-term neuro. She heard her own voice working through it. I was specifically assigned to Emily's floor. Not randomly. Specifically. By a physician who was already maintaining her suppression. The investigators raised that question this afternoon, he said. They're looking at whether your assignment was deliberate. Why would my assignment be deliberate? That, he said, is the question they're asking Varner's attorney right now. She sat with it. The night shift. The specific floor. The specific ward. A transfer nurse with a military background and specialized training being placed in the one location where she might notice what everyone else had been paid or persuaded not to look at. Either it was a catastrophic miscalculation by someone who hadn't thought through what a combat-trained nurse with 11 years of field medicine would notice in a patient presenting as vegetative, or it was something else entirely, and she had been placed there by someone who wanted the situation discovered, and she didn't know which one yet. Her phone was still at her ear. The parking structure was quiet. Outside, Silverbrook was moving into evening, ordinary and indifferent. I need to think about this, she said. I know, he said. So do I. After she hung up, she sat for a long time without moving, watching the light change at the open end of the parking structure. Someone had put her in that room. She just didn't know yet whether they were the same person who'd been keeping Emily Carter in the dark, or the person who had finally decided to turn the light on. She drove home slowly, not because of traffic, but because her mind was doing the thing it did when a situation had too many variables and she needed the motion of driving to organize them. Someone had put her in that room. The question of whether it was deliberate sabotage or deliberate exposure kept turning over, and she kept arriving at the same problem. Both possibilities required someone with knowledge of her specific training, her military credentials, her certification in the neural stimulation protocol. That wasn't public information. It wasn't on her nursing transfer application. It lived in military records that a civilian hospital administrator wouldn't have accessed through routine channels, which meant whoever had placed her on Wing C, third floor, room 317's rotation, had done research before she arrived. She parked in front of her apartment building and sat in the car for another 10 minutes, working backward through the sequence. She'd applied for the Riverview position through a standard healthcare staffing board. Her application had listed her military service in general terms: 11 years, honorable discharge, field medicine. The specific protocols she was certified for were documented in her military record, not her civilian nursing file. Someone had pulled her military record, either to confirm she was the right person to hide Emily Carter from, which made no sense because a nurse with her background was the worst person to assign to a patient being maintained in artificial suppression, or to confirm she was the right person to find it. She went inside. She made tea. She didn't drink. She opened her notebook to a clean page and wrote a single question at the top. Who wanted her found? Below it, she wrote everything she knew about the timeline. Emily's grandmother dying in October, the trust, the November evaluation, and the agreed-upon language. Reeves being brought into the arrangement, and she was increasingly certain it was an arrangement, not his initiative, by someone with board-level access to the hospital. The February increase in sedation, and then Claire's transfer application submitted in late February, processed in 3 days, which was fast for a hospital of Riverview's size. Assigned immediately to the night shift on the long-term neuro ward by Reeves, which should have been a decision that served the conspiracy, but instead put the exact wrong person in the exact right position. Unless Reeves hadn't made that scheduling decision alone. She wrote, Board member. Hospital visibility since 2019. Personnel matters. She stared at the page. Then she called General Carter back. He answered on the first ring, which told her he'd been waiting. The board member, she said. The one connected to Varner. What's his name? A pause. Why? Because I want to know if he's the person who put me there intentionally or the person who made a mistake. Another pause. Longer. His name is Warren Dole. She wrote it down. Is he cooperating with investigators? As of this afternoon, yes, voluntarily. His attorney reached out to the DA at noon before the investigators came to him. The general's voice was careful. Which is interesting. He went to them before they came to him, she said slowly. Yes. That's the move of someone who wants to control the narrative of their own cooperation, or someone who wanted to be on record as having disclosed before being compelled. Or, General Carter said, someone who set something in motion and is now trying to manage the consequences of it going further than intended. She let that sit. Warren Dole had been on the hospital's board for 4 years. He was connected to Varner, who was connected to Reeves. He had visibility into hospital personnel decisions, and he had voluntarily disclosed to investigators approximately 4 hours after the pharmaceutical records had been found, as though he'd been watching for the moment when the situation became undeniable and had made a calculation about which side of it he wanted to be standing on. Was he the one who recruited Reeves? She asked. That's what Varner's attorney has indicated, he said. Dole approached Reeves in January of last year. Emily's grandmother was already ill. Dole had access to the trust structure through his firm's relationship with the estate's financial management. He needed someone inside Emily's care who could manage her condition. And Reeves agreed. Reeves was in financial difficulty. His divorce settlement finalized in November. The financial benefit was structured as a consulting arrangement with the firm, 3 payments over 18 months, coded as medical advisory work. It was so mundane, Claire thought. The mechanism of it. A man in debt. A trust with a secondary beneficiary. A firm with a board member who had hospital access and no ethical architecture. The extraordinary machinery of keeping a young woman's mind locked in her own body, built out of the most ordinary materials, money, desperation, institutional trust. Does Dole know what he put in motion by placing me there? She asked. I don't know, the general said. That's the question my JAG officer is asking his attorney tomorrow morning. She looked at the question she'd written at the top of the page. Who wanted her found? Maybe the answer was simpler than she'd been making it. Maybe Warren Dole, somewhere between October and February, had looked at what he'd agreed to and had understood that it was going to end, that these things always ended, and had begun constructing his exit before the door closed. Maybe placing a nurse with a specific documented capability in Emily's ward was the exit, a careful, deniable way of ensuring the situation would be discovered by someone qualified to discover it, while Dole himself stayed one step removed from the moment of exposure. Or maybe she was giving him too much credit for strategy, and the real answer was that he'd simply made a stupid scheduling recommendation to Reeves without understanding what a combat nurse actually knew. She didn't know yet, but she would. Get some sleep, she told the general. You too, he said, in the tone of someone who also would not. The answer came 3 days later, in a conference room she wasn't in. What she got was a summary from Major Tillman, delivered over the phone in the precise, unemotional language of someone who has spent a career converting complex human disasters into structured findings. Warren Dole had cooperated fully. His cooperation had been genuine in the sense that he wanted to limit his own exposure, and it had been strategic in the sense that he understood exactly how much to give in order to accomplish that. He had disclosed the full arrangement, the trust, the firm, Reeves, Varner, the financial structure. He had provided emails, financial records, and a timeline that corroborated Emily's account of the overheard conversation in March. On the question of Claire's assignment, Tillman said, Mr. Dole states that the scheduling recommendation was made by Dr. Reeves independently. He denies knowledge of Ms. Bennett's specific military certifications. Do investigators believe him? Claire asked. A pause. He provided his communication records going back 14 months. There's no indication he researched Ms. Bennett's background. The current view is that Reeves scheduled her on Wing C because she was a new transfer with a night shift availability and no existing institutional relationships. Someone who he believed would keep her head down and not make waves. Claire absorbed that. The most straightforward explanation. Not strategy, not a deliberate exposure play. Reeves had put her in that room because she was new and unknown and had a military background that he'd interpreted wrongly as meaning she would be deferential to institutional hierarchy. He had looked at her resume and seen a soldier who followed orders. He had not read her correctly. And Dole? She asked. What's he facing? Conspiracy to commit fraud, financial elder abuse, the grandmother's trust qualifies under state statute. Potentially accessory charges depending on how the DA reads his knowledge of the medical conduct. Tillman paused. His cooperation likely reduces his sentencing exposure significantly, but it doesn't remove it. The DA has made clear this is going to trial. Reeves? Criminal charges filed this morning. Unlawful administration of a controlled substance, willful patient endangerment, fraud. Those are the headline charges. There may be additional counts as the record review completes. Another pause. His license has been permanently revoked. That was confirmed by the state medical board at 9 this morning. Permanently. The word sat cleanly. Varner? License suspended pending criminal investigation. He's cooperating through counsel. The agreed-upon language in the evaluations is documented. The email chain is explicit. He's unlikely to practice medicine again. 3 men. A trust, a debt, an arrangement, and 8 months of a young woman being kept from her own life. The criminal process would move at its own pace, slow, procedural, punctuated by hearings and filings and the grinding work of institutional accountability. But it was moving. The gears were engaged and they would turn until they reached the end. Ms. Bennett, Tillman said, there's one more thing. On behalf of General Carter's office and in coordination with the Army Surgeon General, a formal letter has been drafted for the State Nursing Board. It details the sequence of events, the validity of your clinical observations, your appropriate use of authorized protocol, and the retaliatory nature of the complaint filed against your license. He paused. It's a commendation, essentially. General Carter wanted you to know it was coming before it arrived. She was quiet for a moment. Thank you, she said. She meant it, but she was already thinking about what came next. What came next was 6 months of the hardest, most specific, most demanding work she'd done since the field. Emily Carter's rehabilitation was not a smooth process. That needed to be said plainly, because the story that institutions tell about recovery tends to be a montage. The patient standing, then walking, then speaking in complete sentences, then smiling in a therapy room while sunlight comes through the window. The reality was that Emily had good weeks and weeks where the progress reversed, where muscle memory that had returned retreated again for reasons that weren't fully understood, where the emotional processing of what she'd experienced while conscious and unreachable hit her in waves that her body wasn't yet strong enough to absorb without collapsing under the weight. There was a Tuesday in the 2nd month where Emily refused to get out of bed. Not from physical limitation, she was capable, but because she'd spent the previous night in a dream state where she'd been back in the locked place and had woken at 3 a.m., convinced she wasn't out, that the room she was in was the same room, that the return to consciousness had itself been the delusion. Claire had been called by the night nurse. She'd driven in at 4 a.m. and sat on the edge of Emily's bed in the half-dark and had not immediately said anything comforting, because sometimes the comforting thing is wrong. Tell me what you remember, she said. Emily told her. The dream, the locked sensation, the confusion of surfaces. Her voice was steady. Her speech had come a long way, but her hands were gripping the blanket. That's a normal response, Claire said, not in a dismissive way. In the literal sense. Your brain spent 8 months in a suppressed state, and it's rebuilding its map of what's real. Sometimes the map glitches. That doesn't mean the territory has changed. Emily looked at her. How do you know it hasn't? Because I'm here, and I'm not someone you're imagining. She paused. You imagined things in there. You told me. You said some of what you heard was real, and some of it blurred into something else. Yes. This isn't blurred. I drove 20 minutes in the dark, and I'm annoyed about it, and my coffee's bad. She held up the paper cup she'd grabbed from the hospital's night vending area. Does that feel like a dream? Emily looked at the cup. Something in her face shifted. Not quite a laugh, but the precursor to one, the specific expression of someone whose brain has just been offered an unexpected anchor. "No," she said. "Get some sleep, real sleep. We have PT at 9 and Renata at 11, and you're going to hate both of them, same as always." Emily pulled the blanket up. "Claire." "Yeah. Thank you for coming. You can stop thanking me for things that are my job. This isn't your job. It's 4 in the morning." Claire looked at her. "Go to sleep, Emily." She drove home at 5:15 with the bad coffee, and she thought about the word job and what it actually meant, and she didn't have a clean answer. Some things you do because you're paid to do them, and some things you do because they're the right thing, and some things you do because there is simply no version of not doing them that your particular architecture permits. The three categories weren't always cleanly separate. Emily took her first unsupported steps in the 4th month. Not dramatic steps, 5 of them, from the parallel bars to a point marked on the floor, with a physical therapist named Marco hovering 6 inches to her left and his hands up and ready. She made it to the mark and stopped and breathed and didn't fall. Marco said, "Good." Emily said, "That's it? Just good?" "5 more tomorrow." "I want to do 5 more now." "Tomorrow," he said, with the flat authority of someone who understood that the enthusiastic push was where injuries happened. She turned around, unsteady but upright, and looked at Claire, who was standing near the door with her notebook, because she'd been in the middle of a documentation review when Marco had texted that it was happening. Claire looked back at her. 5 more tomorrow, Claire said. Emily pointed at her. "You're both terrible." But she was almost smiling, and her cheeks had color, and the girl standing at the parallel bars, thin still, working hard still, frustrating and stubborn and funny, in the dry, understated way of someone who'd had a long time to develop an interior life, looked nothing like the still form in room 317 that 17 specialists had written off in 8 months of professional consensus. The criminal proceedings moved on their own timeline, parallel to Emily's recovery, connected but separate. Claire followed them the way she followed most things she couldn't control, at a distance, with attention, without letting them occupy the center of her day. Reeves's trial was set for late fall. The DA's office had built a case that was specific and documented and did not rely heavily on expert opinion because the record was largely self-explanatory. 19 weeks of pharmaceutical records, financial transactions, the email chain, Emily's testimony, which had been recorded and preserved with the same care that Drennan's team had brought to everything else in the investigation. Emily gave her deposition in the 5th month of her rehabilitation. Claire went with her, not because Emily needed accompaniment legally, but because she'd asked, and because being present for things that mattered was something Claire had decided, somewhere in the middle of the graveyard shift in a room that smelled like recycled air, was a commitment she was willing to make. The deposition took 3 hours. Emily was precise and specific, and occasionally had to stop and reorient because the emotional material was still close to the surface in ways that didn't respond to her will. She described what she'd heard, what she'd experienced, the quality of the consciousness she'd maintained through 8 months of being categorized as absent. She described the conversation with Reeves in March, like his voice, the words, the specific phrasing of "better this way," with enough particularity that the DA's attorney had to visibly manage her own expression. When it was over, Emily sat in the hallway outside the deposition room and looked at her hands for a while. "Is it going to matter?" she asked. "In the end. Your testimony? All of it, the trial. Whether they actually—" She paused. "I don't want to watch the rest of my life waiting for a verdict." "You won't," Claire said. "The verdict is going to happen on its schedule. Your life is happening on yours. Those are separate clocks." Emily looked at her sideways. "That's very zen for you." "It's not zen, it's logistics." Claire leaned back in the chair. "You have PT in 2 days and your speech metrics from last week were better than the month before. That's your clock. Reeves's clock is the DA's problem." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then, "I keep thinking about the other patients, the ones he might have, the ones who came through that ward and didn't have someone who noticed." Claire had thought about that too. It was the part that didn't resolve cleanly, the part that stayed in the background of the investigation like an unlit corner. The review board is looking at 5 years of patient records, she said. They'll find what's there. And if there's more, then there's more accountability, more families who get a real answer instead of an institutional one. She met Emily's eyes. That matters, even if it's hard. Emily nodded slowly. She looked at the wall in front of her, the generic institutional painting, abstract blue shapes, and she sat with whatever she was sitting with, and Claire let her sit with it, because not everything needed filling. I want to do something, Emily said finally, when I'm strong enough, something that uses what happened. Like what? I don't know yet. Maybe. She paused. Patients who can't speak for themselves. People who are in there and can't get out and don't have someone like you noticing. She glanced at Claire. Is that a thing? A field? A career? Patient advocacy. Disorders of consciousness research. There are programs. I was pre-med, Emily said. Before. She said before the way she said a lot of things, not with grief exactly, but with the acknowledgement that the word divided her life into two portions that had different textures. I'd been accepted to a program. That was October, the month her grandmother died. You can go back to it, Claire said. I know. She looked at her hands again. I just look at it differently now, what I want to do with it. She paused. I was going to do oncology, because my grandmother, anyway. Now I keep thinking about neuro, about what it means to be present and unreachable and have everyone around you making decisions based on the assumption that no one's home. Claire said nothing. There wasn't anything to add to that. In the 6th month, 3 things completed themselves. Riverview Medical Institute issued a formal public statement, not a press release carefully threaded with non-admissions, but a formal written apology reviewed by the hospital board, signed by the incoming chief medical officer, addressed directly to Emily Carter and her family. It acknowledged the diagnostic failures, the administrative misconduct, the inadequate response to clinical evidence, and the harm caused by institutional prioritization of consensus over the individual patient in front of them. It also acknowledged Claire by name. It stated, without hedge or qualification, that a nurse whose clinical observations were accurate and whose conduct was appropriate had been subjected to retaliatory action by hospital administration, and that the action had been wrong. Claire read it at her kitchen table on a Thursday morning with a cup of coffee that she actually drank. She read it twice. She thought about Sandra at the main desk on her first night, and the flat look on the outgoing nurses' faces at shift change, and the ergonomics of Dr. Pryor's chair designed to make a person feel small. She didn't feel vindicated exactly. Vindication implied that she'd been waiting for external confirmation of something she wasn't sure of herself. She'd been sure. The microtremor, the motor response, the moment in room 317. She'd known what she was looking at. The apology was the institution catching up to a truth that had already been established. But it mattered, not for her certainty, but for the record. For every nurse who would come after her in some other hospital on some other night shift looking at some other patient that the institution had already decided was finished. The record mattered. She put the document in a folder and filed it. The second thing that completed itself in the 6th month was Reeves's trial. She wasn't in the courtroom. She'd been asked if she wanted to attend by General Carter, by Tillman, by Emily herself, and she'd said no. She had given her testimony by deposition in the 4th month, 2 hours of precise sequential account, and she had no desire to sit in a room and watch the proceeding that would follow from it. She followed it through Tillman's brief updates. The financial records went in. The pharmaceutical documentation went in. The email chain went in. Varner testified under his cooperation agreement, and what he said on the stand was specific and damaging and delivered with the flat resignation of someone who has nothing left to protect. Emily's deposition was played in court. Reeves took the stand in his own defense. He presented as composed and technical and certain of his own expertise, and the DA had dismantled him methodically and without visible satisfaction, which was the more effective approach. She'd asked about the pharmaceutical variance. He'd said error. She'd asked about 19 weeks of error within a consistent range. He'd said system issue. She'd asked about the countersignature, which was his, applied manually each week. He'd said he trusted his documentation process. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. The verdict came in on a Tuesday afternoon. Guilty on all substantive counts: unlawful administration, willful patient endangerment, fraud. Dole, who had already entered a plea agreement, received his sentence the following week: 4 years with restitution. Varner's sentencing was scheduled for the following month. Reeves received 7 years. Claire heard this from Tillman at 4:30 on a Tuesday, standing in the PT room while Marco ran Emily through her current protocol, and she said thank you and ended the call and stood there for a moment. Marco looked up. "Good news?" he asked. Verdict came in. He nodded. He'd known enough of the situation to understand what that meant. He looked at Emily, who was working through a sequence of balance exercises, her back to them, unaware. "You gonna tell her?" he asked. After. When Emily finished, cooling down with her hands on the parallel bars and her breathing controlled and slow. She'd built significant endurance by month 6, her lung capacity mostly restored. Claire said it plainly. "The Reeves verdict came in today." Emily went still. "Guilty," Claire said. 7 years. Emily looked at the floor. She didn't say anything for a moment. Her hands stayed on the bars, knuckles neither white nor relaxed, the grip of someone letting something land. "Dole?" she asked. 4 years plea agreement. "Varner?" "Pending. Next month." Emily nodded. She turned around and faced the room, and her face was doing several things at once, things that didn't resolve into a single readable expression, which was appropriate because nothing about this was simple enough for one face. "Okay," she said. "Just that." "Okay." Claire had expected more, had expected the emotional release that people expect from these moments, the catharsis. But Emily had spent 8 months in a room where no one thought she could feel anything, and she'd felt everything, and she had learned in that particular school to process internally before externalizing. She was still doing it. Maybe she always would. "Okay," Claire said. Meant. The third thing that completed itself in the 6th month was Emily walking out of the rehabilitation building under her own power. Not the PT room, the actual building, the front entrance, down the short flight of steps, into the parking lot where her father was waiting beside his car, in the particular posture of a man who had waited a long time for a specific moment and was now making himself stand still inside it. She went down the steps one at a time, with no hand on the rail. She could have used the rail, but she chose not to, and that was hers to choose. General Carter watched her come. His arms came up when she reached the bottom of the steps, and she walked into them and stayed there, and he held her with the contained force of someone who had been very careful for a very long time, and was finally allowed to stop being careful. Claire stood at the top of the steps. She had her notebook. She'd had it every day for 6 months, and it had pages of Emily Carter's recovery documented in the same precise, time-stamped format as the first entry, left periorbital microtremor observed 123. And it would go into a formal record that would contribute to the body of evidence that prolonged functional dissociation was treatable, detectable, and had a specific profile that could be identified by practitioners trained to look for it. There was a researcher at a university program who had contacted Claire in the 3rd month after reading Drennan's published summary of the case. The researcher was working on exactly this: detection protocols for disorders of consciousness in long-term care patients, the gap between what machines measured and what trained clinical observation could identify. She'd asked if Claire would be willing to contribute to the research, to review materials, consult on detection methodology, potentially train other practitioners in what she'd seen and how she'd seen it. Claire had said she'd think about it. She'd thought about it for 2 months. She'd said yes last week. She looked at Emily in her father's arms, in a parking lot, in the ordinary afternoon light of a city that had no idea what had happened inside one of its buildings over the last 9 months. The world was always like that, indifferent to the specific dramas occurring inside its structures, the life and death work happening on the 3rd floor, while the street level went about its business. That was fine. The work didn't require an audience. It required people who showed up in the dark on a night shift and looked at what was actually there. General Carter looked up and met Claire's eyes over his daughter's head. He nodded. She nodded back. Emily pulled back from her father and looked up at the building, not with fear, not with hatred, with something more complicated than either. The building was what it was. It had held her for 8 months, and it had hurt her, and it was also where someone had finally looked. "Ready?" her father asked. She turned away from the building and didn't look back. "Yes," she said. 7 months after the night she'd walked into Riverview Medical Institute with a duffel bag and a credentials folder, Claire Bennett sat across a table from Dr. Vera Hollis and a researcher named Dr. James Osei, and a hospital administrator from a different city who had reached out through Drennan's office after reading the summary report. They were talking about a protocol, a formal detection framework for disorders of consciousness in long-term care patients, what to look for, how to document it, how to distinguish between the micro-indicators that mattered and the background noise of a body in prolonged stasis, how to make the invisible visible in a way that survived institutional skepticism. Claire had her notebook on the table, the waterproof cover, the spiral binding, the kind that fit in a cargo pocket. Osei asked, "What would you say is the single most important component if you had to identify one thing that made the difference?" She thought about it. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give the accurate one rather than the easy one. Deciding that the patient was the primary source of information, she said, not the chart, not the prior evaluations, not the consensus. The patient in front of you in that specific moment, with your full attention on what they were doing rather than on what you expected them to be doing. Hollis made a note. "The chart tells you what people have already concluded," Claire said. "The patient tells you what's actually happening. If those two things are in conflict, the patient wins. Always." Osei looked at her. "That sounds simple." "It is simple," she said. "That's the part that's hard to explain. It's not a technical gap. It's an attention gap. We train clinicians to aggregate and assess and make decisions efficiently, and efficiency is good, but efficiency in the wrong direction covers up a lot." She paused. Emily Carter had a micro-tremor at the outer corner of her left eye that was present for at least several months before I saw it. No one documented it because no one was looking for something that contradicted what they'd already agreed was true. She said it without indictment in her voice. The people who'd missed it weren't monsters. Most of them weren't, anyway. They were people moving through a complex environment under time and institutional pressure, and they had allowed the weight of prior agreement to substitute for present observation. It was a human failure. That made it harder to fix than a technical one, and more important. So the framework, Hollis said, at its core, it's about reorienting attention. It's about giving practitioners permission to trust what they observe over what they've been told to expect, Claire said. That's a different thing. Permission is institutional. The framework has to come with authority. The authority for a bedside nurse on a night shift to make a notation that contradicts the attending's existing assessment, without that notation being subject to removal or retaliation. The administrator from the other city looked up. "That's a significant structural change." "Yes," she said, "it is." He held her gaze for a moment. She held his back. "It's also the part that matters most," she said, "because the clinical observation is only as useful as the record that captures it. If the record can be deleted by the person whose prior conclusion it contradicts, the observation never happened." She set her hands flat on the table. "That's what we're actually fixing, not the medicine. The structure that either protects the medicine or swallows it." The room was quiet for a moment. Then Osei said, "All right, let's build it." What? She drove home that evening through the end-of-day traffic that she'd gotten used to, the city in its 5 p.m. configuration. People moving toward wherever they were going with the particular determination of a place that had things to do. Her apartment had a couch, a kitchen table, a decent lamp, and books that were no longer mostly in boxes. She'd unpacked them in the 4th month, during a weekend when she'd been too tired to go out and had decided, somewhere between the 2nd box and the 3rd, that she was staying. Not because it was a perfect city, or a perfect job, or a perfect anything. Because the work here was real, and she was the person to do it, and that was enough of a reason. She'd made her share of mistakes in the past 7 months. She'd been too hard on Marco twice over PT scheduling disagreements, and he'd called her on it the 2nd time with the directness of a person who didn't intimidate easily And he'd been right. She'd been short with Emily during a difficult session in month 3, in a way she'd apologized for and meant the apology, and known immediately that it had come from her own exhaustion rather than anything Emily had done. She'd misjudged a documentation timeline in the early stages of the case that had required a minor correction in the formal record. She was not the nurse she sometimes appeared to be in the way institutions narrated their heroines. The flawless clinical observer, the uncomplicated advocate. She was a person with 11 years of very specific experience and the capacity to read certain things accurately that other people missed, and she got tired and made errors and had to be corrected and corrected herself. That mattered, not as a caveat, but as the actual condition under which the work happened. People who were imperfect and still showed up and still looked and still wrote down what they saw. That was the whole thing. That was all it ever was. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. Emily. She answered it on the speaker. What? Rude greeting, Emily said. Her voice was clear and easy and almost entirely restored, with a slight texture to certain consonants that might or might not resolve further over time, and that she'd decided to stop caring about 3 months ago. I'm applying to the program. The pre-med program? The one at Hargrove University. They have a neurological sciences track. A pause. I talked to the advisor today. She said my prior acceptance credit is still valid with updated materials. When does the application close? 6 weeks. That's plenty of time. I know. Another pause. I'm going to put you down as a reference. I hope that's okay. Claire looked at the road. What would you want me to say? The truth, Emily said simply. Whatever the truth is. She thought about the truth. The whole of it. The girl in the bed and the girl on the phone. 8 months and 6 months. The locked place and the walk to the parking lot. The application to a program in October, the year her grandmother died, that she'd never gotten to attend, and the application now from the other side of everything. They'll get a good reference, she said. Thank you. A pause. Claire. Yeah. I know you don't like being thanked for things. Correct. I'm going to anyway. A brief silence. For noticing, that's all. I know there was a lot more after that, but that's the part I think about. Someone just noticed. Claire stopped at a red light. Outside, the city moved around her in its ordinary way. People crossing the street, a delivery truck double parked, a kid on a bike cutting too close to the curb. I looked at you, she said. That's all I did. I looked at what was actually there. A lot of people looked, Emily said. You saw. The light changed. She drove. There are people who move through institutions like ghosts, present, functional, technically counted, but not actually seen. They exist in files, in chart notations, in consensus conclusions. They become what the building has decided they are, because buildings have more authority than people, in practice. And authority has a way of becoming truth when enough time passes. What Claire Bennett did in room 317 was not complicated. She stood at a bedside in the middle of the night with a penlight and paid attention to what was in front of her instead of what she'd been told to expect. She wrote it down. When the record was deleted, she wrote it down again. When she was told to stop, she made a decision about which kind of wrong she could live with, and she chose the one that required her to walk back into a room she'd been ordered out of. She had been dismissed and underestimated by people who had institutional authority and used it as a substitute for looking. She had lost her position, been threatened with her license, been accused of conduct she had not committed. She had done all of this without certainty that it would work, without knowing if Emily Carter was going to respond, without any guarantee that the record she was building so carefully would ever matter to anyone. The nurses who never get found out exist in every system. The Reeves of the world, not always criminal, sometimes just negligent, sometimes just tired of being wrong, exist in every institution. The institutional structure that allows chart entries to be deleted by the person whose conclusion they contradict exists in every hospital that hasn't specifically built a wall against it. That was the wall Claire was now building. One framework, one training session, one conversation at a time. It would not save everyone. It would not fix the system. It would give the next nurse on the next night shift the institutional backing to write down what she saw and know it would stay there. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, the whole thing. The nurse they had tried to silence had been quiet all along, not because she had nothing to say, but because she'd been saying it in the only language that mattered, the precise, time-stamped, unretractable language of the record. She had written it down, and it had been enough.